It's with great pleasure that I now invite Professor Piggott to address us. John.
My notes. Thank you very much, Peter and Jeff, for those kind words. It's a great honour to be able to present the Hancock Lecture for 2013. I first met Keith Hancock when I was appointed. My first job when I returned to Australia was at the University of Adelaide as a lecturer, and I was just saying to him that this is a long time ago, 1979, 1980, and I was just saying to him that I remember talking to him about retirement income in the tea room at the University of Adelaide, and it was probably the first time I'd ever thought about retirement income. Before getting going on the lecture completely, fully, I'd like to just acknowledge a few individuals who I guess have helped form my thoughts and who I reference without being too explicit in the content of the lecture, and they include, most of them are associated with CEPAR, I'm pleased to say, Hazel Bateman, Kagri Kumru, Olivia Mitchell, Mike Sherris, and Alan Woodland. And I want to make a special mention as well of Raf Chomik, who's a senior research fellow at CEPAR. I've had a lot of conversations with him. He always challenges everything I say, and he produces wonderful slides, I think. I think this is a highly appropriate topic for the Hancock Lecture because Keith Hancock, in addition to all those other public policy roles that were identified earlier on, chaired a committee in the first part of the 1970s into the establishment of a social security system, a national insurance system in Australia. It was a casualty of the Whitlam dismissal. The final report was not delivered until 1976, I think, and those of you who have been here for a while will know that Gough Whitlam's government was dismissed in November 1975. That left Australia with a very atypical retirement income system. It had a means-tested age pension, and the means testing more or less lasted except for some periods around the Whitlam era when pieces of it were taken out. It's had a means-tested age pension now for more than a century, and now, because there was really no earnings-related piece, we have a pre-funded mandatory earnings-related defined contribution scheme, which promises nothing about benefits. It defines a contribution with additional voluntary contributions, which are both allowed and encouraged. So it's a very different story than the kind of story that you get in most OECD countries. So what I want to argue, this is kind of the message, I want to say that that framework has turned out in the light of an ageing demographic to be very good, that you can defend it, I think, by appealing to two strands in the economics literature, public economics, especially taxation, and experimental economics. And I want to do this by looking first at the age pension and then at the mandatory saving regime. And then I want to say that this is a bridge part built, that we haven't yet got to decumulation, and we really need to get to decumulation to make this work well for us. The lecture outline will go like this. I'm going to start by talking about demographics because that's where this all begins, and then I will talk about each of the pillars and the way they've been designed and how their design relates to what economic analysis has to tell us, and then finally I'll come to implementation issues and policy and products. So that's where I'm going to begin. The most standard graph or chart around demographic change refers to the age dependency ratio, and nowadays that's usually reduced to just the dependency ratio. And it's a ratio of the population that is over some given age, in this case it's 65, as a proportion of the population that is supposed to be of working age, and usually that is taken to be 15 to 64. And this graph shows what that ratio has done from the time of federation, more than a century ago, up to 2050, and you can see that it's climbing. This reflects three things. It reflects increasing longevity, it reflects changes in fertility, and it also reflects migration. I'm not going to talk separately about migration because it's just too complicated. It's not that it's not important, but it's embodied in this chart. I will talk a little bit in more detail about the way in which demographic plays out, the way in which this demographic plays out. We are not alone in ageing. Ageing is happening pretty much everywhere, in every jurisdiction in the world. Median age is going up, and this age dependency ratio is upward sloping in almost every country. Here are two countries in Asia which are often mentioned. You'll see in Japan this age dependency ratio starts going up quite early. In China, it's still quite low. It's a young country, but the rate of increase of that country is very dramatic. So that before we reach 2050, China will in fact have an older demographic than we do. So just life expectancy first. It will be encouraging to the men in the audience, I guess, that Australian males live as long as anyone. There we are, just tying with the Japanese there. Australian females have some distance to go. These other countries, Australia's had a very gentle increase in life expectancy. You'll notice in 1901, male life expectancy sat at 55, and it didn't get up to 65 really until the Second World War. But the access age for the means-tested age pension that we have has been 65 through that whole period. So its reach has hugely increased just as a result of increases in life expectancy. But countries like Japan and China have had very rapid increases in life expectancy, and this reflects rapid development. These curves are still sloping upward, even at 2050, and it raises the question, well, will life expectancy move to some limit, or will it go up, will lifespan go up forever? And I don't think anyone knows the answer to that, and that's one of the issues around designing retirement income policies, that there's a lot of uncertainty that is associated, a lot of systematic uncertainty that's associated with increases in longevity. If we get a little bit more nuanced about life expectancy, something that's very interesting has happened over the last century or so. In the first part of the century, the biggest contribution to increasing life expectancy came from changes in mortality at young ages, reductions in mortality at young ages. This happened, reduction in infant mortality, but also reductions in communicable diseases, and so forth. So that was the major driver. But in the second half of the century, it has been people at mature ages, the reduction in mortality at mature ages, which has driven the increase in overall life expectancy. And so in some ways that's taken pension funds, governments, even families by surprise. And I think that's quite important. If you look at this analysis internationally, say between 1950 and 1980, and then 1980 to 2010, there are some countries where that later age mortality reduction, earlier mortality reduction actually doesn't move at all in that second period, right? And countries where in the first period later age mortality reduction doesn't move at all. So it's a very striking differential. And I think that's part of this story as well. It's part of the story that it takes a long time to adjust, and surprises can occur even in demographics. So this is my second last demographic slide, and then I will move to other things. This is fertility, and fertility there for the three countries that we've so far been looking at demonstrate that fertility has come down everywhere, and that's another feature. Fertility in most countries has come down, often not as low as this. So in India, for example, fertility, as I recall, lies around 2.5 or 3 still, but nevertheless coming down a lot from where it was. This graph shows what we call total fertility, the total fertility rate, which is the estimated number of children per woman at a given point in time. So the whole of a woman's fertile period is taken into account. And once again, this goes from Federation up to 2050. That's the calendar range that we're looking at. This very dramatic reduction, you would think would be a bit of a warning for people advocating pay-as-you-go pensions, but it took quite a while for that to dawn on anybody at all. In Australia, there was a report by a man called Ubori, I discovered, released in 1975. Right? Barely mentions population ageing. It's about youth dependency, right? More than age dependency. Japan, where this phenomenon had been going on for much longer, where fertility really fell in the 1950s, thought really technical change was here to stay, and this model would continue to work in a sustainable fashion into the future. And of course, China, it's still happening. We've got this dramatic reduction in fertility, and that's still feeding through, I think, into the way China thinks about population aging and thinks about retirement incomes. The other point about this chart is that it shows very clearly for Australia what the baby boom means. There's this kind of hump here. That's the baby boomers, that hump. And that sits there, and it sits there for most OECD countries, sometimes a little bit to the left, but mostly somewhere around there. And it's that disequilibrium which is the focus of much academic activity and much policy activity, and indeed much business activity at the moment. That's really the core of what we mean by population aging. Incidentally, the first time that phrase, population aging, was mentioned in Hansard is 1986, and it was in reference to a report co-authored by one of the CEPAR CIs, Hal Kendig. But it took until the end of the 70s, and the US Social Security Commissioner in 1979 said, "We're confronting a worldwide issue which goes to the very viability of the institution." And that's the first time I can find a reference to the idea that this plummeting fertility actually put under stress these pay-as-you-go plans. This is about what's come to be called demographic dividends, and what it emphasizes is that demographic transition is staged, right? And there's an early stage where you have a relatively large number of people who are of working age, and you have a small number of people who are young dependents, and you have a relatively small number of people who are old dependents too, because typically in this demographic transition, that takeoff of mature age reduction in mortality hasn't occurred. And so that's a period where countries do very well. And if you look at this graph, you'll see where Japan's demographic dividend is, right? It's exactly where people say, oh, the awakening giant, how well Japan is doing, it's going to take over the world. And then Australia has had 22 years of growth, right? Very unusual for an OECD country. Look at where Australia's demographic dividend sits. China's going to come to the end of its demographic dividend period in 2035, and for Australia, it ends right now. The leading edge of the baby boomers, 65, they're going to move into retirement, and that's going to cause this flip. So these marked areas are where 2/3 of the population are of working age. Right? So as soon as you move away from that, it ends. So that's the criterion that's been applied in trying to find these demographic dividends. And then you get this flip, baby boomers get old, and suddenly governments need more revenue than they've ever had before. And that's exactly where Australia is at the moment. What does this mean? Well, we can't say what it means really for Australia yet because we're not there. But if you take European Union countries, then a lot of them are there already. And this rather busy chart gives some idea of what happens. So the question is, can this first part of my talk is really around, well, are pay-as-you-go pensions affordable, right? When they're designed in this kind of way, where there's earnings related, where they're fairly generous, where there's a large payout involved. And this chart tries to depict what is going to happen, what would happen if there were no adjustments made to policy, and then what those adjustments have been, and then what would happen as a result of either current legislation, current reforms, reforms which have already happened, or reforms which have been legislated but are yet to be in place. The pink column there, that's an increase in public outlays just as a result of population ageing. And then the blue and grey lines, they're about changes, for example, in benefits, where governments have pulled back on their promises because they're conscious of the fiscal stress that honouring those promises would create. There are moves around coverage ratios, like survivors, reducing that. There are moves around the employment rate, which is really just increasing the access age so a larger number of people stay in employment for longer, right? But it's another way of reducing the benefits that you pay. And all these together nevertheless lead to, in most of these countries' cases, several percentage points of increase in public pension outlays over this period between 2010 and 2050. Commentators say various things about this. I've been interested when I raise this. So if I talk to Americans, they're inclined to say, but I mean, everyone would realise that a government couldn't keep a promise like that. So, and if you talk to Europeans, they say, but politicians are so good at being able to finesse their promises, right, so that they don't have to deliver on them. And in both cases, the idea is that actually this is nothing to worry about. But it seems to me that it is something to worry about, that it undermines the idea that anyone can plan with any degree of confidence around these very long-term settings for retirement incomes which exist. So I guess the bottom line out of this, for me, is that the traditional prototypical OECD social security model is in trouble, and something needs to happen. And governments have made various parametric changes already to try to buttress that. So this brings me to pension design, and I've thought about pension design a bit over the last couple of decades, and this is a kind of three-pillar system. We always have to have pillars, right? This is a sort of three-pillar system, and it's designed around function. There are various models. If you go to the World Bank, they have a different kind of model. The OECD has a somewhat different kind of model, more related to this. So you have to be a bit careful when it comes to identifying what these pillars mean. But this separates out function. So there's this first pillar, which is non-contributory, which is a safety net, right, there for adequacy purposes. And the two broad design features are that it's either universal, everyone gets it, or it's targeted, only some people get it. Normally they get it on the basis of their means, so it can be means tested or resource tested, and otherwise it's available when you reach a certain age and you satisfy certain residency requirements. And then there's compulsory retirement provision. The word saving is a little bit unfortunate there. Compulsory retirement provision, which could be as pay-as-you-go, as it is in most OECD countries, or it could be pre-funded. And in both cases, this can happen. There are examples where it can happen either through public provision or private provision. And then on top of that, there's voluntary saving, which is typically tax-preferred. And so that's that third column. So this is what Australia looks like. We have a targeted first pillar, Australia's age pension. We have a pre-funded private provision, which is compulsory for employees, and that's our second pillar. And then we have a tax-preferred third pillar, which sits there pretty much integrated with the second pillar. So many employers pay more than they are minimally required to pay. So how did we get here? Well, you can go back to before Federation, and New South Wales had a means-tested pension, which I didn't know until I started digging around for this lecture. But it was in 1908 that we had an Australia-wide means-tested pension. It was quite controversial at the time. First of all, it was introduced for men, and then a couple of years later for women and for those with disabilities. it wasn't the first. So Denmark had one of these as long ago as 1888. New Zealand introduced their means-tested pension in 1898. Denmark still has a means-tested pension. New Zealand moved eventually to a universal pension. So we went the first off the block, but we were quite early on in this design. There were various other things. This is a kind of very potted history, but next major move in retirement provision was in 1938 when an OECD-type, North American-type Social Security National Insurance Plan was proposed. Actually, I think passed. Certainly you can find newspaper articles which say things like, you know, the South Australian Commissioner is very concerned because not enough people are enrolling in this, right? But even though it got that far, it was abandoned as World War II approached, and it never really recovered from that. I've mentioned already the 1976 Hancock inquiry. Then 10 years after that, people were beginning to suss out that actually population aging was causing some problems, at least in the more advanced aged economies, and that led to that, along with a series of other promises and macroeconomic conditions, led to a proposal that, and the reality that industrial relations should have some superannuation in there for employees, and ultimately to the superannuation guarantee, which was introduced in 1992 on a phased basis, eventually reaching its current 9% in 2002. So that's what happened there. If we think about our first pillar, yes, it's a means-tested age pension, and I just wanted to describe it to you. I think that's the next slide. Describe it to you. At the moment, it has an access age of 65, which will move to 67 over the next 10 years or so. Non-contributory, financed from general revenue. It's means-tested. I like to think of it as an affluence-tested pension. So it gives 28% of average full-time male earnings for singles, more than that for couples, for the whole couple, right? So there's a kind of equivalizing between these units. It's tested such that about half the population get the whole pension, 25 to 30% get half of it, 20 to 25% get nothing. It doesn't cost very much. It costs at the moment around 2.7% of GDP, and even in 2050, so the intergenerational report tells us it will cost less than 4% of GDP. So this is a model which it's very difficult to argue this is not sustainable. It's a relatively small number. If you look at Germany's public pension system, its PAYG system, at the moment it's paying 10% of GDP, and that will move to 13%. France pays 12% currently. So the idea that you have a system which gets people out of poverty and which costs this little has to be very appealing. The issues around means testing are, well, people say it costs a lot to administer because you've got to check on the means test. There are personal costs associated with issues such as stigma and filling out forms, compliance costs of various kinds. It's politically risky, people say sometimes, because if you don't have most of the people receiving a benefit from a policy, the policy is more at risk of being removed or abolished. And then there are economic distortions. I don't really think the first three of these objections to means testing are very meaningful. The high administrative costs, I'm trying to find out at the moment from the Ministry for Human Services exactly what those are, but the indications are that they're extremely small as a proportion of the pension outlays. My sense is people do not feel a lot of stigma at receiving an age pension just because it's means tested. I don't think it's been around for more than a century now. It doesn't seem to me that there's high risk of its being abolished. Now, these conditions may not obtain in other countries, but I think they do obtain here. So it's really the economic distortions that are the most important, and the high effective marginal tax rates which are associated with the withdrawal of the pension from people as they move through an income range or an asset range, a resource range from full to zero. So this is the kind of, we call this sort of skyline, the kind of story that you find when people want to talk about the high effective marginal tax rates. And it's important to realize that these tax rates are not just that taper, they combine with income tax, and then they sometimes combine with other benefits, like, for example, health benefits or utilities assistance and so forth. So that when you add them all up, they can easily get to nearly 100%. And there's a lot of research attention, a lot of policy attention paid to try to make those high marginal tax rates lower. But I think maybe that's misplaced focus. And I think that for two reasons. The first is that only about a third of retirees get a part pension. Right? So some people are in a situation where really they're not going to be in a position to get anything other than the full pension as a matter of their life course. And there are another group of people who will get no pension as a result of their life course. So you're looking at only a part of the population which is affected in this way. And in particular, for the rich who get nothing, economists distinguish between income and substitution effects. Neither of those effects apply to that group who are well off and receive nothing. And it's much less costly to the fisc. It's a much less costly policy because it's means tested. It's maybe 2/3 of the cost of a universal policy. And that means that the taxes that you require to cover off the cost can be lower. And so I'd just like to talk briefly about why that's important. And this gets, I think, somewhat economic, so I apologize to the non-economists. So this is a stylized picture. It could be any market, but it could be a labour market. There's a demand curve, there's a supply curve. And on the left-hand panel, what's happened is you've imposed a tax. Previously, there was no tax, now there's a tax. And that teal rectangle is a representation in dollars of the amount of the tax you collect, the actual P times T multiplied by the number of units traded. So that's the actual tax you collect. But there's this red triangle, and the red triangle is a measure of the efficiency cost, which is a separation between marginal cost and marginal benefit. What happens, though, if you need to increase that? Supposing we turned the age pension into something universal and had to have higher labour tax rates, or higher tax rates of any kind, but we'll stay with labour. Then there is going to be the teal on the right, which you can see doesn't increase that much, because although there's a much higher tax rate, there's a lower quantity. And then the increase in the red area is a kind of rhombus. And that's a much bigger area than the original triangle. This idea of very high marginal, tax rates causing very high marginal efficiency costs was actually not in the literature until the mid-1970s. It seems so obvious. People were drawing these diagrams a long time before that. But it was a piece in the Journal of Political Economy by Edgar Browning which made this point, first of all, that it's at the margin that these efficiency costs matter. So if you can keep those labour tax rates low by reducing the costs of the public pension outlays that you have contracted to deliver, that can improve efficiency a lot. And so I think it's quite important to recognise that in this overall debate. People frequently look at the age pension and they don't think about what the distortions are in the area where it's being financed. And there's another somewhat more sophisticated argument as well from the literature, so let me try and get that to you. It really comes from the arguments around taxing capital income. So the arguments around taxing capital income were very rudimentary, I guess, in terms of economic analysis until quite late, until the 1980s. And at that point, models were being built which were able to capture growth, were able to capture life cycles and so forth. In the 80s, there were models which were very persuasive to academic economists, which led to the conclusion that the best rate was zero. And the intuition was that if you had a zero capital income tax rate, you would have more saving, therefore you would have more investment. If you had more investment, you'd have higher growth and eventually higher wages as well, because labour would be mixing with a higher and higher stock of capital. And that changed the way a lot of people thought, a lot of academic economists, and indeed it filtered through to policy. A lot of policy analysts ended up thinking about capital taxes. But then it became a much more nuanced argument from there, and other points were made. For example, the way in which leisure and consumption and labour get mixed through the lifespan vary. So you'd really like to tax differently at every age-specific taxes. But if you can't do that, then maybe, particularly in a world with uncertainty, it might be worth allowing capital income to take some of the weight and give a bit more liquidity to people who relied fully on labour income. So there are arguments then for positive taxes on capital. And I guess the most recent influential piece on that appeared in the American Economic Review in 2009, and it was an argument that in the absence of age-specific taxes, in an OLG model, you would have quite significant positive taxes on capital income, not the same as the tax on labour. So we're a long way from any notion of a comprehensive income tax with the same rate on each, but nevertheless a positive tax. So when you begin to think about means testing, what do you have with the means test? The means test is essentially a capital income tax on retirement income. It is an age-specific capital income tax. And I like to think of it as a tax which complements something which is inherently untaxable, which is retirement leisure. And if you have a tax, if you have something that you can't tax at all and you want to make the tax as broad and as non-distortionary as possible, then a second best response to something which is untaxable is to tax its complement, tax something which goes along with it. And so this idea that you might have an age-specific capital income tax embodied in a means test provides additional analytic strength, I think, to the argument around, argument in support, the economic arguments in support of means tests. So that's means tests. I now want to talk some about the second pillar, mandating retirement saving. I noticed on this slide, which just gives the outline of the superannuation guarantee, the preservation to age 55 is actually being sequenced through to 60, so it's an incomplete slide. And I've already told you how we have evolved to the superannuation guarantee. These are kind of its current specifications. The important point for me is that there's no decumulation structure. So then you have to say, well, why do you bother, right? And indeed, many policymakers and many academic economists say, why do you bother? Why should we mandate life cycle saving? And I think there are two reasons. The first comes from Hayek in 1960. So if you're going to give people some subsistence to get them out of poverty at old age, regardless of the way they've behaved, then it makes sense to control that free riding by insisting that they do some saving as a proportion of their income to manage that free riding. So that came out of the Constitution of Liberty, and people in Germany in particular write papers that are all about Hayek pensions, which try to design pensions that do this. The second, and to me much more important reason, is people are subject to what's sometimes called dynamic preference inconsistency. And this has been in the literature, in the economic literature, for more than 50 years, but it's really only been in this century that this idea has been applied in large models to policies. So this is the basic idea that the way you think about rewards depends upon how far they are away. So if you think about that left-hand axis, that's the time to reward. And if you're way over on the left-hand side of the chart, you value the higher reward, the blue reward, more than you value the small reward, which are quite close to one another, but they're both a long way away from where you are. But as you approach them, right, your preferences change. Right? And when you're very close up, you'd rather grab that small reward straight away than wait a few months for the large reward. And so you get a preference reversal. So this comes really from psychology. I did my first degree as an art student. I majored in psychology, and the idea of immediate gratification is something that turned up over and over again in psychology, and how hard it was to delay gratification. And so the way an economist thinks about this is when you're up close, you discount the future very heavily, have a very high discount rate, and that's kind of immediate gratification. And it leads naturally to a somewhat more subtle idea that people would actually reach for a commitment device to help them handle this question of intertemporal allocation of resources. And this idea comes out in the literature. So in 1956, which is the first time we have dynamic inconsistency modeled in the economics literature, we have Strotz saying, we're often willing even to pay a price to pre-commit future actions and to avoid temptation. Now, this wasn't around Social Security. It wasn't around retirement saving. It was just an observation. People have come across Christmas accounts, right, where you get a low rate of interest, but the bank puts a little bit aside for you every week, all year, so that you've got some money to spend on presents at Christmas. It's that kind of notion. And the first time that I've been able to find a reference to it with respect to Social Security was a remark by Samuelson. It's in a discussion of an NBER volume, a National Bureau of Economic Research volume, and much of this was critical of Social Security, right? But he discussed a paper by Merton, and he made these remarks. Much that a public system accomplishes could have been contrived privately. He points out that America in the century up to 1937 was the richest on earth, but it wasn't. Most people didn't make it. Right? And voters are at least partially aware that they're doing the wrong thing, that they're giving in to temptation. And then he says, models that ignore this miss an important point of the problem. So, actually, I don't have time to go into it, I'll leave it, but it's interesting that this same kind of idea appears in Hansard in the debate over the age pension as far back as 1907, but that will wait for later. These ideas, though, really didn't get traction, as I said, until this century in these large models. First of all, we needed some empirical evidence. So I think it's fair to say that academic economics was captured or seduced by the idea of rationality, kind of what I think of as naive rationality, up until the 1990s. And it was only gradually with the role of experimental economics that the limitations of that presumption became clear, and experimental economics became quite influential in the 80s and 90s. And Thaler was one of the early people who did experiments in economics. This is a paper out of Economics Letters in 1981. It was a very new journal then. And he did a simple thing. He asked people, he said, you can have $15 now. If I made you wait a month, how much would you need? If I made you wait a year, how much would you need? If I made you wait 10 years, how much would you need to make it balance the $15 today? And then he discounted these back. The 10-year guys had a discount rate of 19%. The 1-year people had a discount rate of 120%. The 1-month people had a discount rate of 345%. So this idea of impatience, of grabbing something very close up, was borne out empirically. And then experimental economics kind of came of age with a piece in the Journal of Economic Literature in the early 2000s, which surveyed all this discounting experimental literature. And this is a chart from that where you see you've got the discount rate actually in the denominator on the vertical axis. And you can see that cluster of low diamonds, right? That's all the people who are making a grab for immediate gratification. So there are other pieces of evidence around this kind of thing, pointing to explicit desire for commitment devices, and also for people who make bad decisions when they're making one-off decisions, like what sort of a pension plan to choose or what sort of health insurance to choose and so forth. I want to leave those aside. I'm not sufficiently across them really to discuss them. I'm just asserting that they exist. So the way in which this developed was that there was that initial Strotz piece. Then Phelps and Pollock wrote a piece around inconsistent preferences in 1968, had very little influence then. And then those same ideas were reconfigured and extended by Leibson in 1997. And really all it was this idea of building into the preference function a rate of discount which moved with the time to delay. So there was inconsistency built in that way. And then in 2001, Gull and Pessendorfer, I think I've got that pronunciation right, actually built a tractable functional form which had pre-commitment in it. And that then enabled large-scale models to be built with those kinds of preferences embedded. So up until this point, right, we had models, all the big models were telling us how bad social security is, how bad forcing people to save is, how bad articles going back to the 70s, bad labour supply incentives, bad saving incentives, bad this, bad that. It's all negative in terms of economic analysis, academic economic analysis cast around efficiency. Now we have the first group of papers which try to embody this aspect of human behaviour which Samuelson back in 1987 said was an important point of the problem. And when you embed these self-control preferences in these large models, you just get a somersaulting of the way in which they rank social security and other policies. So Imre Horoglu, I think she's Turk, but I think I have the pronunciation right. I watched her on a YouTube, one of those TEDx things the other day, present this material. It was very interesting. She used that Leibson-type discount rate story, and she found that social security actually was welfare improving. It was a good thing. My colleague Kagri Kumru and Thanopoulos, his co-author, had a piece in the Journal of Public Economics in 2012 which used that pre-commitment preference function and found the same thing. And it's also been applied to taxation. And the idea of taxation and self-control comes out with the result that you actually have capital subsidies, because if you have self-control problems, then you need to bribe people to save. So there's capital income subsidies that are associated with that. I'm quite taken with the idea, to go back to means testing, that you could have a kind of client-centered policy. Right? So you could think of a model in which some people are rational, are good at delaying gratification. They go to university and they get good degrees and they get good jobs and they work hard and they delay their gratification and they earn a lot of income, and they're at the top, they don't get any pension. There's another group of people who actually have completely different preferences, and they're just hopeless at self-control and they give in to temptation, and whatever you do to them in terms of providing them with an age pension at the end or not, their behaviour is not going to much change, right? And you give them a pension. So you've got a policy, and a single policy, you're kind of orienting it toward these different clients within society. And that paper I'm writing with Kagri at the moment, but it's got some distance to go. Okay, so now let me turn to this decumulation in these last few minutes, because I think that's the area here where Australia really falls down. This is the part of the bridge that's yet to be built. What I've put up here is a kind of current Australian picture of decumulation. So in that left-hand panel, you have all that red, and that's the proportion of an annual payout of superannuation. It's important to get this interpretation right, and I think I've got it right. It's the annual payout of superannuation which is taken as a lump sum, and the proportion taken as a pension. So the proportion taken as a pension spans many ages. right? Because you could be 77 and still getting a pension. That's part of your pension. But you only get your lump sum once. And you can see gradually, as more and more people get to be retired, and some of them take an account-based pension, some other kind of pension, that blue area is getting larger as proportionately. And in particular, since tax-free superannuation at 60 came in, more people are holding back on taking the lump sum because the interest from their accumulation is also tax-free if they leave their asset pool behind the superannuation veil. But when it comes to longevity insurance, the picture is indeed bleak. So on the right-hand side, I've got a graph which shows what's happened with various kinds of annuities, short-term annuities, long-term annuities. These are what actuaries and finance people call term certain annuities. So there's no longevity insurance involved. It's just a payout of principal and interest for a given number of years. If you die, your heirs get the balance. Right? Life annuities, which provide genuine longevity insurance, is the blue line which tracks along the x-axis there. It's a market which practically doesn't exist. Australia is the only OECD country with an established mandatory pre-funded structure. Now, I said it was atypical. It's not unique to have that. There are several countries, the Netherlands and Switzerland are two others, right, which doesn't have any kind of effective decumulation structure. So both the Netherlands and Switzerland have that. And I think we badly need support at the policy level for longevity insurance, coordination of agencies. Many agencies are involved in this. There's APRA, there's the Tax Office, there's FAXIA, which does the age pension, there's the Treasury. They need to get together to sort out a structure which allows the development of longevity insurance instruments. And these can be of many kinds. Right? So there's a standard life annuity, and economists analysed this. Yari was the first in 1965. But of course, annuities preceded that. In every case, the actual product has preceded its economic analysis. There are deferred annuities, which have been discussed both by Wayne Swan and Bill Shorten at the Tax Forum as something that they want to support, but there isn't the policy support for it at the moment. There are pooled annuity funds, and once again, that would be a model that could work for some of our large industry funds, but the structure isn't there yet. There are new products called ruined contingent life annuities, which are much more appealing than standard annuities. The way they work is they take your pool of funds, they attach it to an equity index, they pay you that equity index minus some clip, and then they guarantee that if the market tanks and you lose all your money, you're ruined, you are guaranteed a life annuity. So that's why it's called a ruined contingent life annuity. And the idea is that it provides you with insurance when you need it, rather than all the way along the line, regardless, as with a standard life annuity. We don't know. We don't understand much of this. We don't understand how people retiring from the workforce view the rest of their lives. We don't really understand the retirement decision itself very well. We don't understand what would constitute an acceptable commitment device through that decumulation period. So we don't really understand what products should be offered and designed and what kind of support should be provided for them to make them work. And I think that's all still to come. So there's a huge research and policy agenda in front of us. That doesn't mean that I'm resiling from the position I started with. I think the structure we have is sustainable in the face of an ageing demographic. It's just that we haven't built the full bridge. So my final slide is pretty much the same as my first. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much indeed.